This is an RNZ podcast.
Kia ora, and welcome to Elemental from RNZ. I'm Allan Blackman from the Auckland University of Technology.
And I'm Alison Balance, and we interrupt normal transmission with a special piece of breaking news. I'll start with a question. What's one of the holy grails for any scientist, Alan?
Well, apart from saving the world or, getting a Nobel Prize, we scientists pretty much live or die by what we publish. And so we want to be published where it matters, in a high-impact journal where lots of people will see the publication.
And as a science broadcaster, I can tell you that there are some high-impact journals which everyone is always immensely proud to have on their CV, and that's because it's very hard to get a paper accepted by them. So, Alan, what is your big news?
So the big news is that because of having done this Elemental podcast series, myself and my partner Rebecca Jelley have just got a paper published in Nature Chemistry.
Woohoo! That's brilliant. What's the title of this paper?
It's called The Most Boring Chemical Element.
Can you please give us a short rundown, Alan?
Okay, so I'll read the tagline / abstract for you. Could it be boron or borium that is the most boring? You'll need to read to the end to find out.
That's a great opening, but it doesn't tell me anything. Come on, spill the beans.
Well, okay, so essentially we started off by defining the word boring, and so that automatically excludes some obvious candidates like, for example, phosphorus, that bursts into flame automatically in air, fluorine, that reacts with every chemical element pretty much, uranium, it's radioactive, it's fissionable. So what we did was to look on the chemistry index, which is called SciFinder, and this index is all of the papers that have ever been published in chemistry. And what we were looking at was the number of papers that every element on the periodic table had appeared in.
I presume this tells you how many publications are associated with each element.
Yes, indeed. Yep.
And you were hoping that you could simply go, oh, that one's got hardly anything, it must be dead boring.
That was the idea, yes, to begin with, yes.
Right, so which were the most and the least cited elements?
So carbon, probably not surprisingly, had around about 3.3 million citations, and the fewest was francium with 2,392.
So does that make francium the most boring element?
Well, no, it doesn't actually, because there's got to be a reason why francium is the element that is least cited in the literature. And so that obviously then makes it interesting, doesn't it? So francium can't possibly be the most boring because it's the least cited. So, so straight away when we did this, we sort of realised the shortcomings of this approach. So we had another go and we systematically appraised all of the elements on the periodic table.
You mean at this point you realised you actually had to do some work?
Yes, exactly. You're so right. Yes, this wasn't going to end up as easy as we thought it would be. So what we did was then we went through group by group on the periodic table to find individual candidates. And again, having been through the Elemental podcast, there's something interesting about every damn element on the periodic table. We know that. And so really what we were looking for was essentially those elements that had the least interesting properties or were really sort of middle of the road, boring, didn't do much sort of things. And on the basis of that very, very, very scientific appraisal, we came down to a short list of 6 elements that we thought might vie for the title of most boring element. We reckon strontium, scandium, hafnium, praseodymium, thulium, and protactinium.
Right. I have to say the latter half of the alphabet is unfairly overrepresented in that shortlist. But that aside, how did you go about eliminating the shortlist down to your one element?
Well, that was really tough because then what we did was to go back to the number of citations that we got from SciFinder. And sort of when we did that, we realised that we might have been overlooking some of the more interesting properties of these 6 elements. And certainly strontium, for example, had many, many, many more citations on SciFinder than we'd actually realised. And so, deeper looking into the literature, found, more interesting facts about each of these 6 elements. But, there can be only one, I guess.
So did you find one that you thought was the most boring element? Which was it? Ta-da!
Well, I'm not sure I should say, really.
Come on. Don't keep me in suspense.
Well, if we went through our sort of systematic appraisal of all of them, then we might have thought that protactinium possibly would be the most boring element. However, protactinium has still got around about 4,000 or so citations on SciFinder. And what that means is that there are people who have studied and do study protactinium. Probably not as many people who have studied and do study carbon, but that's not the point. Protactinium is interesting enough for some people to want to study it. And so basically what we said was that there is no such thing as the most boring element. That gives it away, doesn't it?
Nicely dodged, Professor. That's the same principle as there's no such thing as an ugly baby. They're all beautiful to someone.
Yep.
So somebody out there finds protactinium interesting and therefore it can't be boring.
Indeed.
It's a very philosophical distinction, I think.
Yes, and being unpopular is not the same thing as being boring. I totally think that's very, very true. And of course, we don't expect people to agree with us necessarily, and obviously everyone's going to have their own opinions on this.
So that was, as we all know, Professor Allan Blackman from the Auckland University of Technology, talking about his paper, co-authored with Dr. Rebecca Jelley from Auckland University on the most boring chemical element, just published online in the journal Nature Chemistry. You'll find a link on our webpage, rnz.co.nz/chemistry, or just search online. It's well worth a read.
You've been listening to a bonus episode of the Elemental Podcast about a scientific, or maybe not, paper inspired by this very same podcast, which you will find in all the usual podcast places. I'm Allan Blackman.
And I'm Alison Ballance. Mā te wā.